You think you're tough because you survived a power outage last winter. You think you're resilient because you made it through that camping trip where it rained for 2 days straight. You think you understand what real survival looks like because you watched every episode of Alone and read a few books about wilderness skills. But let me tell you something that will completely shatter your confidence. If you were dropped into Ice Age Europe 30,000 years ago, you wouldn't last a week. Not 5 days, not 3 days. Probably not even 48 hours before the brutal reality of that frozen hellscape would crush you like an insect. If you're using these to fall asleep, that's literally why I make them. So subscribe maybe and tell me where you are and what time. I check comments and it's like Berlin at breakfast, Boston at bedtime, all at once. This isn't some hypothetical challenge where you get to bring your modern gear and knowledge. This is the real deal. Ice Age Europe was a death trap that made Antarctica look like a tropical vacation. We're talking about a continent locked in perpetual winter for thousands of years, where temperatures regularly dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, where blizzards could last for weeks, and where every single day was a fight against forces specifically designed to kill you. The landscape was an endless expanse of frozen tundra, stretching from what is now France all the way to Siberia, broken only by massive glaciers that towered hundreds of feet into the gray sky. But here's what makes this story absolutely mind-blowing. Some humans not only survived in this nightmare world, they actually thrived. They built complex societies, created incredible art, and developed technology so sophisticated that we're still trying to figure out how they did it. These weren't primitive cave dwellers stumbling around with sticks. These were the most remarkable survivors in human history, and their story is going to completely change how you think about what humans are capable of when everything is trying to kill them. Picture this. It's 30,000 years ago, and you've just been transported to what would eventually become modern-day France. But this isn't the France you know. There are no vineyards, no rolling green hills, no Mediterranean warmth drifting up from the south. Instead, you're standing on a vast plain of permafrost that extends in every direction as far as your eyes can see. The ground beneath your feet is frozen solid to a depth of several hundred feet. The air is so cold it burns your lungs with every breath, and the wind carries ice crystals that feel like needles against your exposed skin. Above you, the sky is a constant slate gray, heavy with clouds that promise more snow. And snow there is, everywhere you look. Not the pretty dusting you might see in a Christmas movie, but deep, wind-packed drifts that can swallow a person whole. This snow has been accumulating for thousands of years in some places, compressed into ice so hard you could build a house on it, which, incidentally, is exactly what the people who lived here actually did. The temperature never gets warm enough to melt anything. During what passes for summer, you might see the thermometer climb to a balmy 20 degrees below freezing. During winter, which lasts for 8 or 9 months of the year, temperatures plummet to levels that would kill you in minutes if you weren't properly prepared. We're talking about cold so severe that your breath freezes instantly and falls to the ground as ice crystals, where the moisture in your eyes starts to freeze if you keep them open too long, where exposed skin begins dying from frostbite within seconds. But the cold isn't even the worst part. The wind is what would really get you. Imagine standing in the path of a freight train made of ice, and you'll start to understand what the wind was like in Ice Age Europe. These weren't gentle breezes or even strong gusts. These were hurricane-force winds that could knock you off your feet and drag you across the frozen ground until you disappeared into a snowdrift. The wind was constant, relentless, and absolutely merciless. It would find every gap in whatever clothing you managed to cobble together and steal every bit of warmth from your body. And speaking of clothing, let's talk about what you'd be wearing in this frozen wasteland. You wouldn't have your modern winter jacket with its synthetic insulation and waterproof shell. You'd own socks or insulated boots. If to have thermal underwear or wool, you were incredibly lucky. You might have some crude animal skins wrapped around your body, but more likely you'd be wearing whatever scraps of hide you could scavenge from animals that were already dead when you found them. These makeshift garments would be stiff as boards in the cold, impossible to move in properly, and about as effective at keeping you warm as a paper bag would be at keeping you dry in a rainstorm. Your shelter situation would be even more dire. There are no trees in this landscape, at least not the kind you could cut down to build a log cabin. The few stunted shrubs that manage to grow in this environment are twisted and gnarled by the constant wind, barely rising above knee height. So where exactly would you sleep? How would you get out of that killing wind? The ground is frozen too hard to dig into, even if you had proper tools, which you don't. You might try to pile up some snow to create a windbreak, but the wind would just blow it away faster than you could stack it. Meanwhile, the people who actually lived in Ice Age Europe had figured out solutions to all these problems. They built elaborate shelters using mammoth bones as structural supports and mammoth hide as covering. These weren't simple lean-tos or basic huts. These were sophisticated architectural achievements that could house dozens of people and stay warm even when the temperature outside dropped to lethal levels. Some of these structures were so large and complex that archaeologists initially thought they were looking at the remains of temples or ceremonial buildings. But you wouldn't know how to build one of these mammoth bone houses, even if you had access to the materials, which you wouldn't. First, you'd need to kill a mammoth, which was roughly equivalent to taking down a modern-day elephant, except this elephant was covered in thick fur, weighed twice as much, had tusks longer than your entire body, and was specifically adapted to survive in conditions that would kill you in hours. Even if you somehow managed to find a dead mammoth, you'd need to know exactly how to butcher it, how to preserve the meat so it wouldn't rot, how to process the hide so it would remain flexible in freezing temperatures, and how to construct a framework that wouldn't collapse under the weight of snow and ice. The people of Ice Age Europe had spent thousands of years perfecting these techniques. They knew which bones to use for which parts of the structure. They knew how to cure the hides so they would shed water but still allow the structure to breathe. They knew how to create ventilation systems that would let smoke out without letting deadly cold air in. They knew how to build these houses so they would actually generate and retain heat, turning what should have been a death trap into a warm, comfortable living space. But let's say you somehow managed to find shelter. Now you need fire. And this is where your situation goes from desperate to completely hopeless. In Ice Age Europe, there was virtually no wood to burn. The landscape was dominated by grasses, sedges, and other small plants that would burn for maybe a few seconds before turning to ash. The people who lived there had to get creative in ways that would blow your mind. They learned to burn bones, specifically mammoth bones that were rich in fat and marrow. These bones could burn for hours, producing intense heat that could keep a shelter warm through the longest winter nights. But you'd have no idea how to make bone burn properly. You'd probably try to light it like wood and watch in frustration as it refused to catch fire, all while your fingers turned black from frostbite and your core body temperature dropped to dangerous levels. Even if you somehow figured out the bone burning technique, you'd still need a way to start the fire in the first place. There are no convenient matches or lighters in Ice Age Europe. The people who lived there used flint and steel techniques that took years to master, creating sparks that could ignite carefully prepared tinder made from dried grasses and birch fungus. They knew exactly how to strike the flint, at what angle, with how much force, and they could do it with fingers that were numb from cold. You'd be fumbling around with chunks of rock, probably cutting yourself in the process, while hypothermia slowly shut down your vital organs. But fire is just the beginning of your problems. You also need food, and this is where Ice Age Europe becomes truly terrifying. This wasn't an environment where you could forage for berries or dig up edible roots. The plant life was limited to hardy grasses and sedges that were barely digestible, even if you knew how to process them properly. The bulk of the calories in this ecosystem came from animals, massive animals that were perfectly adapted to kill or avoid anything that threatened them. We're talking about woolly mammoths that stood 14 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed 8 tons. Cave lions that were 25% larger than modern African lions and had evolved specifically to hunt in pack formations. Giant cave bears that weighed over 1,500 pounds and had claws longer than your fingers. Short-faced bears that could run 40 miles per hour and were built like living tanks. Woolly rhinoceros with horns that could impale you faster than you could blink. These weren't animals you could hunt with a pointy stick and good intentions. The people of Ice Age Europe developed incredibly sophisticated hunting strategies that involved dozens of coordinated hunters working together with weapons that took months to craft properly. They built elaborate traps and driving lanes that could channel entire herds of animals into kill zones. They developed spear throwers that could launch projectiles with enough force to penetrate thick mammoth hide. They created composite tools with multiple materials working together to achieve maximum effectiveness. You wouldn't know how to make any of these tools. You probably couldn't even identify what materials to use. The hunters of Ice Age Europe knew which types of stone would hold the sharpest edge, which wood had the right flexibility for spear shafts, which animal sinews made the strongest bindings. They knew how to heat treat flint to make it easier to work, how to attach stone points to wooden shafts so they wouldn't come loose at the moment of impact, how to balance a spear so it would fly straight over long distances. Even if you somehow managed to craft a basic weapon, you'd still need to get close enough to use it. These animals had senses that were finely tuned to detect threats. A mammoth could smell you from miles away. A cave lion could hear your heartbeat from hundreds of yards. They lived in an environment where everything was trying to eat everything else, so they were constantly alert for any sign of danger. You'd probably never get within throwing distance of your prey before it either ran away or decided you looked like an easy meal. And if you did somehow manage to wound an animal, you'd better hope you killed it instantly, because a wounded mammoth or cave bear was essentially a mobile death machine with nothing left to lose. The hunters of Ice Age Europe knew exactly where to place their strikes to bring down these massive creatures quickly and cleanly. They understood animal anatomy better than most modern veterinarians. They could read tracks and scat to determine not just what species had passed by, but how many individuals, how long ago, what direction they were heading, and whether they were healthy or sick. But let's imagine that by some miracle you actually managed to kill something. Now you're faced with a new set of impossible challenges. You need to butcher this animal before it freezes solid, or before scavengers arrive to steal your kill. In Ice Age Europe, you'd be competing with cave hyenas that hunted in packs of 30 or more, dire wolves that were larger and more powerful than any modern wolf, and scavengers that could strip a carcass clean in hours. The people who lived there had developed butchering techniques that were works of art. They could completely process a mammoth in a matter of hours, separating meat from bone, hide from muscle, extracting every possible ounce of nutrition and useful material. They knew which cuts would preserve best, how to render fat for cooking and light, how to prepare bones for burning, how to process hide for clothing and shelter. They wasted absolutely nothing, because waste meant death. You'd probably spend so much time trying to figure out where to start cutting that the meat would freeze before you got anywhere meaningful. Frozen mammoth meat is essentially a giant rock that you can't cut with primitive tools. The people of Ice Age Europe knew how to work with partially frozen meat, how to keep certain sections warm while processing others, how to use the cold to their advantage in preservation. And then there's the question of where you'd store all this meat, assuming you somehow managed to butcher it properly. Ice Age Europe didn't have refrigerators, but it didn't really need them. The entire landscape was a giant freezer. The trick was knowing how to use natural cold storage effectively. The people who lived there dug elaborate cache pits in the permafrost, lined with stones and covered with hides to keep scavengers out. They knew how to portion meat so it would freeze in convenient sizes, how to protect it from freezer burn, how to rotate their stores so older meat got used before it went bad. You'd probably just pile meat on the ground and hope for the best, which would result in all of it being stolen by scavengers within the first night. Or you might try to eat as much as possible immediately, which would make you violently ill, since the human digestive system can't handle massive quantities of pure protein without other nutrients to balance it out. The people of Ice Age Europe understood nutrition in ways that would impress modern dietitians. They knew exactly how much fat they needed to consume to balance lean meat. They knew which organs provided essential vitamins that prevented scurvy and other deficiency diseases. They processed bone marrow for its concentrated nutrition and brain tissue for its unique fatty acids. They even figured out ways to extract nutrients from materials you'd never think of as food sources. Meanwhile, you'd probably be dead from malnutrition within 2 weeks, even if you had access to unlimited meat. Your modern diet hasn't prepared your digestive system for the realities of surviving on wild game alone. You'd develop deficiencies that would weaken your immune system, slow your healing, and make you vulnerable to infections that would have been minor problems with proper nutrition. But nutrition is just one piece of an incredibly complex survival puzzle that the people of Ice Age Europe had mastered through thousands of years of trial and error. They had developed social systems that allowed large groups to work together effectively during hunts and food processing. They had leadership structures that could coordinate complex activities across multiple family groups. They had systems for sharing resources that ensured everyone got fed even during lean times. These weren't simple egalitarian societies where everyone did whatever they felt like. These were sophisticated cultures with specialized roles, complex social hierarchies, and elaborate rules governing everything from mate selection to resource distribution. Some individuals were master toolmakers who spent their entire lives perfecting techniques for creating the most effective weapons and implements. Others were master trackers who could read the landscape like a book and predict animal movements days in advance. They had master hunters who understood animal behavior so intimately they could predict exactly where a mammoth herd would be 3 days from now. They had master craftspeople who could work with materials in ways that seem almost magical to us today, turning simple bone and sinew into complex mechanical devices that could multiply human strength and precision. You, on the other hand, would be a complete liability to any group unlucky enough to encounter you. You'd consume resources without contributing anything meaningful in return. You'd slow down hunting parties with your inability to move quietly or read the signs that meant life or death to everyone else. You'd probably get people killed by making noise at the wrong moment or failing to follow protocols that existed for very good survival reasons. The social dynamics alone would crush you long before the environment got its chance. These people lived in groups where every individual had to pull their weight or risk being expelled into the wilderness to die alone. There was no room for dead weight, no safety net for people who couldn't or wouldn't contribute to group survival. If you couldn't make tools, track animals, process food, maintain shelters, or contribute specialized knowledge, you became a burden that the group literally couldn't afford to carry. But let's imagine somehow you managed to integrate into one of these survival groups. You'd still face challenges that would break your spirit long before they broke your body. The psychological pressure of living in Ice Age Europe was beyond anything modern humans have experienced. Every single day was a confrontation with the very real possibility of death. Not the abstract, distant possibility of death that we occasionally contemplate in our comfortable modern lives, but immediate, present danger that could manifest in dozens of different ways at any moment. You could freeze to death if your fire went out during the night. You could starve to death if hunting parties came back empty-handed for too many days in a row. You could be torn apart by predators that were bigger, faster, and more vicious than anything alive today. You could get lost in a blizzard and wander in circles until exhaustion and hypothermia claimed you. You could suffer an injury that would be minor in our world, but becomes fatal when there are no hospitals, no antibiotics, no surgical procedures to save you. The people of Ice Age Europe lived with this constant awareness of mortality, and it shaped every aspect of their existence. They couldn't afford to take unnecessary risks. They couldn't afford to be careless with resources. They couldn't afford to let emotions override practical decision-making. Every choice they made was filtered through the question of whether it increased or decreased their chances of surviving another day. This psychological pressure created a level of mental toughness that's almost incomprehensible to us. These people could watch family members die horrible deaths and still get up the next morning to continue the business of staying alive. They could endure physical hardships that would hospitalize modern humans. They could make life or death decisions quickly and calmly because hesitation meant death for everyone. Your modern mind, shaped by comfort and safety, would crumble under this relentless pressure. You've never had to make a choice where the wrong decision would kill not just you, but everyone depending on you. You've never had to watch resources dwindle while knowing that failure to find more meant everyone you cared about would starve. You've never had to function effectively while carrying the constant weight of survival responsibility. So the next time you complain about your Wi-Fi being slow or your coffee getting cold, Remember this. The people of Ice Age Europe faced challenges that would destroy you in hours. Yet they didn't just survive for 30,000 years. They created some of humanity's most incredible achievements in the process. You wouldn't last a week in their world, but maybe that's exactly why we should have more respect for what they accomplished and what real resilience actually looks like.